I walked into a law firm to finalize my divorce, but instead I was handed a warning that my life had already been erased. They didn't just want my money, they were framing me for an organized scheme to ensure I would vanish behind bars for an enormous sentence. The waiting room of Miller & Associates smelled of expensive mahogany and desperation. I was sitting on a leather chair that had seen better decades, clutching my manila folder like a lifeline. Inside were the documents that were supposed to finalize my divorce. A clean break, or so I thought. My palms were sweating, staining the edges of the paper. I checked my watch for the 10th time in 3 minutes. My attorney, Marcus, was running late, which wasn't like him. He was a man who lived by the clock, someone who treated seconds like currency. When the heavy oak door finally creaked open, I stood up too quickly, my foot catching on the rug. The folder flew from my grip, spilling my life's wreckage across the polished floor. Legal filings, bank statements, and the private correspondence I'd been agonizing over for months slid across the hardwood, scattering toward the feet of a man who had just entered. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit that fit him with unnerving precision. He didn't look like a client, and he certainly didn't look like a lawyer. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. He bent down, his movements fluid and calculated. He picked up a page from my deposition, the one detailing my ex-husband's offshore accounts. As he reached for the next, his eyes flickered toward me, then back to the document. He lingered on a specific paragraph for a second too long. My heart hammered against my ribs. I hurried over, stammering an apology, my cheeks burning with the indignity of the situation. "I'm so sorry. I'm a bit of a mess today," I murmured, reaching for the papers. The man didn't move. He kept the sheet with the bank account numbers firmly held under his manicured thumb. As I reached down to retrieve it, he leaned in, his shoulder brushing mine. The scent of rain and cold iron clung to him. Then he spoke. Not to me, but toward the air in front of him, his voice barely a breath. "You're holding the wrong evidence, Miss Miller. If you walk into that office and hand these over, you won't be leaving through the front door. Your husband didn't just hide money. He's tangled in a massive organized scheme, and they've already replaced your lawyer with one of their own." I froze. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was insane, but the icy intensity in his eyes stopped the sound in my throat. He pressed a small, cold metal object into my palm, along with the last of my papers. "Don't look at it here," he whispered, his grip tightening for a fraction of a second on my hand, enough to leave a mark. "The walls in this building are wired. If you want to survive the next 24 hours, walk out, don't stop for coffee, and do not, I repeat, do not, go back to your apartment. They're waiting for you there, and they've already planted illegal weapons in your closet to make sure you get an enormous sentence for crimes you didn't commit." He didn't wait for a response. He stood up, adjusted his cuffs with terrifying nonchalance, and walked toward the exit. I stood there, paralyzed, the metal object burning a hole through my skin. I looked toward the inner office door, the door where my lawyer was supposedly waiting. The handle began to turn, but the man didn't open it to welcome me in. He was peeking through the crack, his eyes cold and devoid of recognition. The stranger's warning echoed in my mind like a siren. I looked at the handle, then at the elevator doors sliding shut behind the man in the charcoal suit. I had a choice: step into that office and walk into a trap, or run into a world I no longer recognized. I took a breath, tucked the papers into my bag, and turned toward the stairs. But as I turned, I heard the inner door swing wide open behind me. "Ms. Sinclair," the lawyer's voice boomed, sharp and demanding. "We don't have all day. Why are you heading for the stairs?" I didn't answer. I didn't even look back. I just ran. The stairwell was a concrete cavern of echoing footsteps and my own ragged breathing. I didn't know where I was going, only that the lawyer, or the man pretending to be him, was gaining on me. His dress shoes clicked against the metal steps with rhythmic, terrifying confidence. He wasn't running. He was hunting. Every instinct I had screamed that the man in the charcoal suit had been right. If I stopped now, the life I knew would be incinerated, replaced by a staged scene involving illegal weapons and a fabricated connection to an organized scheme that would ensure an enormous sentence. I reached the ground floor and burst through the fire door into the lobby, nearly colliding with a frantic-looking courier. I didn't stop. I shoved my way through the revolving doors and plunged into the chaotic hum of the city. The afternoon sun felt blindingly bright, almost mocking the darkness I'd just stepped out of. I remembered the cold, heavy object the stranger had pressed into my hand. My fingers were still trembling as I ducked into a crowded alleyway between two towering office blocks. I jammed my hand into my pocket, pulling out a small encrypted key drive and a crumpled piece of paper with a handwritten address in the outskirts of the industrial district. I checked behind me. Through the glass storefronts of the lobby, I saw the lawyer emerge. He wasn't looking for me in the crowd. He was speaking into a lapel mic, his expression devoid of the warmth he'd projected earlier. He pointed toward my car, a silver sedan parked half a block away. I watched, paralyzed, as two men in dark jackets approached the vehicle. One of them produced a sleek black object, a tool of some kind, and slid it into the lock. They weren't stealing it. They were planting something. The realization made my stomach drop. My apartment wasn't the only trap. My own life was being methodically dismantled to serve as a container for evidence that would destroy me. I needed help, but who could I trust? The stranger had warned me about a massive organized scheme, a web so deep that it likely infiltrated the very institutions I'd been taught to rely on. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text from an unknown number. Do not go to the police. The Internal Security Department has been compromised. Meet at the old shipyard. Come alone. I looked at the text, then at the bustling street. I felt like a ghost walking among the living. I pulled my coat tight, my eyes darting toward every dark-tinted vehicle that slowed down. My heart felt like a trapped bird, beating against the cage of my ribs. I needed to know what was on that drive. I ducked into a dingy, 24-hour internet cafe, finding a terminal in the darkest corner. I plugged the device in, my hands shaking so violently I could barely type. The file directory opened. It wasn't just bank statements. It was a digital dossier of my life, but modified. Doctored logs of encrypted messages, maps to locations I'd never visited, and dossiers on individuals I'd never met. The screen flickered. A command prompt window opened on its own, and text began to crawl across the monitor in a steady, rhythmic cadence. They are watching the connection. Leave the drive. Look up at the security camera in the top right corner. Do not blink. I looked up. The camera was tilted directly at me, a tiny red light blinking like a heartbeat. My blood turned to ice. The door to the cafe swung open, and a man stepped in. He wasn't the lawyer, but he wore the same charcoal suit. He walked straight toward my corner, his eyes fixed on mine with predatory focus. He held a phone to his ear, and as he drew closer, he finally spoke, his voice projecting clearly across the quiet room. "It's time to stop running, Ms. Sinclair. You're playing a game you don't understand, and the board has already been cleared." I stood up, backing away until my shoulders hit the cold brick wall. There was no way out but past him. He reached into his jacket, and for a split second, I saw the glint of something silver. Not a weapon, but a badge. But it wasn't a police badge. It was the insignia of the Internal Security Department, the very group the stranger told me to avoid. He held it up, his face an unreadable mask of authority. "I'm here to offer you protection," he said, though his hand drifted toward his waistband. "Or I'm here to ensure you never make it to that shipyard. The choice depends entirely on whether you give me the drive." I gripped the edge of the desk, the drive still plugged in. My eyes flickered to the exit, then to the man, then to the server room door behind him. I had one chance, but it involved doing the most dangerous thing possible. I reached for the drive, and as I pulled it out, I triggered the fire alarm. The screeching wail ripped through the silence. The man lunged for me, but the cafe erupted into chaos as people scrambled for the exit. I dove under a table, crawling toward the back, but just as I reached the handle of the service door, a hand clamped down on my ankle with the strength of a vice, jerking me backward into the shadows. The grip on my ankle was relentless. I kicked out with my free foot, catching the man squarely in the jaw. He let out a grunt of surprise, his fingers loosening just enough for me to scramble upright. I didn't look back. I burst through the emergency exit and into the suffocating humidity of the alleyway. The siren was still wailing, a dissonant soundtrack to my panic. I sprinted toward the industrial district, my lungs burning, my vision blurring at the edges. Every shadow looked like a pursuer, and every rustle of the wind sounded like a footstep closing the distance. I reached the old shipyard, a graveyard of rusted hulls and rotting timber. It was quiet here, an eerie, heavy silence that felt like a held breath. The address on the paper led me to a decrepit shipping container half buried under tarps. I hesitated, then pushed the heavy metal door. It groaned, revealing a small, dimly lit command center filled with monitors. The man from the lawyer's office was there, sitting in a swivel chair, his face illuminated by the blue glow of a dozen screens. He didn't look like a stranger anymore. He looked like a weary soldier. "You made it," he said, not turning around. "Most people would have handed the drive over and hoped for a deal. You chose to keep running. That's why you're still a threat to them." "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "And why me? I'm just a woman getting a divorce, not a criminal." He finally turned. He looked older, his eyes etched with deep lines of exhaustion. "You aren't a criminal, but you were the perfect candidate. Your husband isn't just cheating on you. He's a mid-level accountant for an organized scheme that deals in human misery. They use people like you, divorcees, quiet, overlooked, to store digital evidence. If the Internal Security Department ever caught wind, they wouldn't go after your husband. They'd go after the accomplice they manufactured. They needed a fall person to absorb an enormous sentence while the real heads of the group slipped away." He tapped a key, and a stream of data flooded the screens. It was a live feed of the very people who had been hunting me. I watched, stunned, as they dismantled my apartment, planting illegal substances and framing me in real time. But then, the screen shifted. The man began typing, his fingers flying across the keys. "What are you doing?" I asked, stepping closer. "Sending this to the only people who can't be bought," he said. He wasn't sending it to the police or the Internal Security Department. He was uploading the entire dossier to a public access database, tagging every major news outlet and watchdog group simultaneously. Once this is public, they can't bury it. If the Internal Security Department ignores this now, their own leadership will be under a massive internal investigation. Just as the progress bar hit 100%, the warehouse door exploded inward. The men in charcoal suits were here. My protector pushed me toward a trap door beneath a loose sheet of steel. "Go! Through the drainage pipe. It leads to the river. Don't stop for anyone, even if they look like the good guys." I didn't argue. I dropped into the darkness, crawling through the muck and cold water until I emerged on the bank of the river, miles away from the shipyard. By the time I climbed onto the pavement, the sound of sirens was deafening. I looked up at the digital billboards lining the bridge. The news flashes were already changing. My husband's face, along with the faces of the men in suits, was plastered across the skyline. The organized scheme was unraveling in a public spectacle that no amount of money could silence. I found a payphone, a relic of a different time, and dialed my mother's number. I was shivering, drenched, and terrified, but for the first time in months, I was the one holding the cards. They had tried to break me, to turn me into a ghost, to bury me under the weight of an enormous sentence for crimes I didn't commit. They had counted on my fear, my isolation, and my silence. They hadn't counted on the fact that when you have nothing left to lose, you become the most dangerous person in the room. I stood there watching the city wake up to the truth. The nightmare wasn't over. I would be in witness protection for years, and I'd be testifying against people who had the power to move mountains, but the trap had failed. I hadn't just escaped the system they tried to build for me. I had burned it to the ground. I hung up the phone and walked into the morning light, leaving the woman I was in that waiting room behind. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was the architect of their downfall.